3 telegrams arrive, one after another, at the chairman's desk. 6 winter towns have just lost their freight lines. And the governor rises from the gallery to speak. A Compass and Codex production. Never stop exploring unknown worlds. And now, Iron Rails and Ruin. A novel of steam, sorcery, and the lawless Montana territories. From Book 3, All the Engines Running. Chapter 14, Vane's Last Move. Scene 1. The hands were still up when the first telegram arrived. 3 of them, in the back rows, the delegates still committed to their position with the particular stubbornness of people who had decided something and intended to be seen deciding it. Wallace's gavel was still resting flat on the table. The chamber had achieved its version of quiet, not peaceful, but loaded, the silence of a room that had absorbed something it hadn't finished processing and was still working on it. Gunnar kept his hands on the edge of the clerk's desk. His left arm had been making its case since they'd come through the assembly hall's front doors, the steam burn specific and unhurried in the warmth of the chamber, the skin pulling tight under his sleeve with the steady patience of something that had decided its moment to be a problem was now. He pressed his arm lightly against his side and stayed where he was. The side door opened. The clerk who came through it was perhaps 30, in a grey wool coat that had been issued to someone taller and rolled at the cuffs to make the difference up. He moved with the slightly forward lean of a man who had been told to hurry and had decided urgency and speed were the same thing. He came to the head of the horseshoe and placed the sealed envelope in front of Wallace with the two-handed formality of someone who understood that what he was carrying mattered and wanted his delivery to confirm it. Wallace's eyes did not leave the room while he broke the seal. He read the contents with the still-faced attention of a man who had spent enough time at the head of a room to know that his face was the room's first draft of what something meant. He finished reading. He set the paper face down on the desk surface. Then he picked up the gavel and brought it down 3 times, not fast, not hard, but with the complete deliberateness of someone who needed 3 strikes rather than 1. "The chair calls for order," he said, not loudly. He didn't need to say it loudly. Gunnar noted the angle of his jaw when he set the paper down, noted the 2 delegates in the horseshoe's right arm, who had also noted it, and were now watching the door. The second envelope came through that door 7 minutes later. The same clerk, or a different one. They had the same coat, the same purposeful lean, the same 2-handed delivery at the raised desk. Wallace opened it without ceremony, read it, set it face down on top of the first. The third arrived before the chamber had resumed its full working noise. The clerk stacked it at the corner of Wallace's desk with the particular care of someone who understood they were building something and wanted the architecture to be neat. 3 envelopes, face down, their seals broken, their contents inverted against the desk's surface. Wallace had not looked up from the room once while they accumulated. Gunnar watched each one arrive. Millhaven was first. He put that together from the couriers' entry angle, the staging depot to the northwest that served the Sable River communities before branching east. Crestford in the second, a higher-altitude settlement, a single freight line, nothing else in winter. The third he held in his chest without naming because the naming was not necessary. It was the math that mattered, and the math was assembling itself with no help from him, building its total the way coal built heat in a properly maintained firebox, steadily, without drama, without announcing the temperature before the gauge showed it. 6 towns. He did not yet know it was 6. He suspected it was more than 3. He found out when Wallace spoke. He didn't read from the envelopes. He didn't need to. He summarized from the chair with the controlled brevity of a man who had confirmed something before he announced it and was now reporting a fact rather than a suspicion. Freight service to 6 communities along the Syndicate's western and northern routes had been suspended, effective this morning, citing operational review and contractual maintenance requirements. Effective duration, unspecified. The chamber did not go quiet. It went louder, the noise reorganizing itself from argument about the evidence into something with sharper edges and less consensus. Two sounds in the same room, neither winning. Then Governor Blackwood rose from his seat in the gallery. He was in the third row of the observers' section, above and behind the horseshoe's right arm, and when he stood, the light from the sconces above him caught the silver at his temples and the precise fit of his coat and the particular quality of his posture, which was the posture of a man performing composure under circumstances that were making it cost him something. He did not call for recognition. He waited for it, and the room gave it to him the way it always gave it to him, because he was the governor, and because authority of that grade produced silence by proximity, even when the room didn't want to give it. "The territory," he said, his voice strained at its edges in a way that could read as distress, or could read as careful calibration of how much distress to show, "cannot afford a legislative disruption of infrastructure that serves 6 functioning communities." He let that land. "The documents before this body raise questions that deserve review. I have said as much. But the questions raised in a chamber do not fill a grain store or deliver medicine before first frost." He looked down from the gallery at the rows of delegate desks, and what he gave them was not threat, but appeal. The appeal of a man who understood practicality as a moral position, which was a more dangerous register than anger. Practical necessity must be weighed. That is not a concession to impropriety. That is governance. He sat. The silence lasted approximately 1 second, which was 1 second longer than it had lasted for anything else this morning. Gunnar watched the delegates in the front rows do what faces did when two legitimate-sounding things arrived from opposite directions. They moved, not toward one position or the other. They moved away from the position they had been in. Two men who had been leaning forward with the evidence files open in front of them had gone still, their eyes drifting from the payment stubs on the clerk's desk to the face-down telegrams at Wallace's corner. A third had set his pen down, which was a small act and not a small thing. He pressed his knuckle against the desk edge. The arithmetic was not complicated. 6 towns in winter, each with a freight line and nothing else. He knew their reserves the way he knew route gradients, from the manifests he'd been logging for 7 months. Millhaven had warehouse capacity enough for perhaps 10 days at current consumption before the shortfalls became visible. Crestford was higher and smaller and colder and had 5, maybe 4 if the temperature kept dropping. The Sable River settlements he did not know precisely, and so he rounded down, because rounding down in logistics was how you arrived at the real number rather than the optimistic one. 72 hours. That was the outside edge before the legislature's nerve broke on its own. He kept his knuckle on the desk and did not let his hand shake, and watched the room work through the calculation at the speed of human decision-making, which was considerably slower than his own and considerably less reliable. The chamber noise continued its work around him, reshaping itself into something new and harder to read, the morning going on at its own pace, with its gaslight steady and its horseshoe full of men who were currently in the process of deciding which kind of problem they were willing to live with. He ran the numbers again and got the same answer. Scene 2. Hey, a quick note before we get back to the story. Our ebooks are now on Amazon. In Book 1 of Colony in Danger, the colony is starving. The Queen won't say why. And the young fire ant sorting seeds is the only one asking the right questions. In Book 1 of the Lego fan fiction series, Brickhaven, he built an entire town out of bricks. Then he woke up as a minifig, but his own creations have now turned on. And in Book 1 of Eagle's Edge, farm boy Marcus took the Roman oath at 16. He had joined Caesar's army and must prepare to be part of the world's greatest military machine. But by sundown he was certain he had made a terrible mistake. If you want the full adventure without the weekly wait, Grab your copy on Amazon now. Find the link in the show description. Go check them out. Okay, back to the story. The main doors opened at 8:20, and Silas Vane came through them the way he did everything, at his own pace in the direction he had decided to go, with no acknowledgement that the choice to enter required any external permission. 2 company lawyers flanked him, charcoal suits, leather portfolios under their left arms, the precise lateral positioning of men who had been placed rather than having chosen where to stand. Vane himself was in the same boardroom grey he'd worn in the Argent, his silver-tipped cane loose in his right hand, his pace unhurried in the way that very expensive shoes on good hardwood produced unhurried. The chamber's noise did not stop. It changed. A single transition between 2 registers, the room's attention moving from its arguments to the doors without any individual making a visible decision to move it. Gunnar tracked this the way he tracked pressure changes, not by looking directly, but by the aggregate behavior of the instruments, the way the delegate in the near right arm of the horseshoe stopped mid-sentence, the way the clerk at the table's edge set down his pen with the care of someone who had just realized he was holding something he shouldn't be seen holding. Vane crossed the floor to the central lectern. He did not request access to it. He positioned himself behind it with the practiced ease of a man who had stood at enough lecterns to have decided that they were all his by default, set his cane hooked over the lectern's edge with its brass serpent head facing out toward the room, and looked at Chairman Wallace. Wallace looked back at him from the raised desk. The moment lasted, perhaps 4 seconds, perhaps 5, in which Wallace's expression went through something that was not quite uncertainty, and was not quite decision, but was the visible process of a man running the specific calculation of whether refusing had worse costs than allowing. Then he set his pen down. "The chair recognizes Mr. Vane," he said. 10 minutes. Vane inclined his head. "Thank you, Chairman." His voice was the same register it had been in the Argent's dining car, unhurried, measured, with the particular quality of something that carried without being raised, filling the stone chamber the way warm air filled a sealed room. "I want to begin by expressing my genuine regret for the disruption this situation has created for the communities in question." He paused, and the pause was not for effect. It had the texture of a man who had composed his remarks carefully enough that the pauses were structural. "The service adjustments made this morning were not made easily, and they were not made without a full accounting of the hardship they impose." Gunnar was standing at the edge of the left arm of the horseshoe now, having moved there when the doors opened. He kept his eyes on Vane's hands. The right hand rested on the lectern's surface, relaxed, fingers slightly apart. The same hand that had turned a water glass through its quarter rotation across a white linen table, adjusting without knowing it was adjusting. A man whose precision was so habitual it had ceased to require intention. Vane explained the logistics the way he explained everything, as facts that had the status of weather. The territory's 6 affected communities were served exclusively by Syndicate-maintained routes. The rolling stock required for high-altitude winter freight was specialized equipment that had been capitalized, maintained, and deployed at Syndicate cost over the preceding 3 years. No independent operator currently held either the equipment certification or the route authority to service those lines under winter conditions. These were not arguments. They were the shape of the ground. "The ironclad Syndicate stands ready," Vane said, "to restore full freight operations to every affected community the moment this body confirms the operational framework under which we have been working." He let that sentence occupy the room. "I want to be precise about what that means. I am not asking this legislature to dismiss any concern. I'm asking it to recognize that disruption of a working supply system in winter conditions before any alternative exists is not justice. It is a different kind of harm visited on people who have nothing to do with any dispute between this body and our organization." He turned slightly, addressing the horseshoe's full arc rather than the chair specifically, and Gunnar watched the delegate's eyes track with him the way eyes tracked a thing in motion, involuntarily, before the choice could be made. The evidence on the clerk's desk had not moved. The payment stubs were still in their row. The photographs of the stripped engine housings were still there, their plain argument still available to anyone who looked directly at them. Most of the room had stopped looking directly at them. Not all of it, not most of it exactly. But the delegates in the middle rows, the ones who had been sitting in the specific neutrality of people who had not yet committed, had the collective expression of men for whom a new variable had arrived and had not yet resolved against the existing data. Their eyes were on Vane. Their pens were down. Gunnar pressed his thumb into the burn on his forearm through his sleeve. The pressure was clean and specific, and it gave his hands something to do that wasn't visible. He thought about the Argent's dining car, the broth in its shallow bowl, the game hen divided into its 6 equal portions before a bite was taken, the water glass turning its quarter rotation over and over, the man who turned it not knowing he was turning it. He had looked across that table at a man who believed completely in what he had built and could point to the outputs of his belief and find them real. He had walked away from an offer that would have made the rest of this unnecessary. He had made the correct decision, and he was now standing in a room watching it cost him something he hadn't fully calculated. Wallace's voice came from the raised desk, level and direct, cutting across Vane's pause. How long will this interruption last? The chamber went still on the question the way it had been going still for a full morning, not the held silence of resolution, but the held silence of something about to tip. Vane turned to face Wallace directly. His expression was the one Gunnar had catalogued in the dining car, patient, regretful, completely convinced. He held the chairman's gaze for a full beat before he answered. That depends entirely, Vane said, on how quickly this body recognizes operational realities. 3 seconds of silence. Gunnar took his father's pocket watch from his breast pocket and read it without looking at Vane again. 23 minutes past 8. Outside the assembly hall's high windows, the winter morning was doing its ordinary work, indifferent to the particular thing that had just been said in a stone room beneath it. 72 hours. That was the outside edge. That was the number he had arrived at by the most favorable assumptions available to him, rounding up where he could, using the manifests he had memorized rather than the manifests he'd estimated. Millhaven, Crestford, the Sable River communities, each of them a specific weight on one end of a scale that was currently balanced against the nerve of a room full of men who had been doing math of their own for the past 10 minutes, and had arrived, several of them, at the same answer. He could not push the 72 hours by looking at it differently. He had checked it twice already. He pressed his thumb harder into the bruise and stood where he was while the chamber found its voice again around him. A different voice than it had started the morning with, its arguments carrying a new variable now, the room working through the specific mathematics of a man who had just stood at a lectern and explained in plain and accurate language that the cost of disagreeing with him would be borne entirely by people who were not in this room. The brass serpent head of Vane's cane caught the gaslight from the nearest sconce and held it without returning it. Vane stepped away from the lectern and moved toward the gallery with the same unhurried step he'd come in on. The 3 lawyers fell in behind him like a shadow with too many parts, and the chamber went back to its arguments, and the arguments were not the same arguments they had been before he walked through the door. Scene 3. Vane took a seat in the gallery's second row with the settled quality of a man who had said everything he intended to say and was now content to let the room do its work. He crossed one leg over the other, his cane resting against his knee with the brass serpent head pointing down at the assembly hall floor, and he folded his hands in his lap and looked at the debate with the patient attention of someone watching a mechanism he had designed perform its function. The 2 lawyers settled in beside him. None of them produced papers or conferred. They simply waited, the way well-made things waited. The debate in the horseshoe had resumed, and its new shape was audible before its content was intelligible. The sharpest voices, the ones that had been demanding immediate suspension of Syndicate authority, were still present, but they were working harder now, their arguments deployed against a different kind of resistance. Phased review, operational continuity. Gunnar heard both phrases from two different delegates within a minute of each other, the language of men who had found a position between conviction and convenience and had decided it was statesmanship. He turned away from the horseshoe and walked toward the back of the chamber. Vesper had been in the rear section since the session opened, not at a delegate desk, at a writing table along the hall's back wall, angled so that she had the room's full geometry visible over her left shoulder while her right hand worked. The cipher pad was open in front of her, its brass wheels showing their letter grid under the gaslight, and beside it the short-handled compass sat face up on the table's surface with the same exact placement she'd given it in the workshop the night Calloway had spread his building plan next to the staff roster and they'd run the operation through for the first time. Gunnar had never asked why she placed the compass that particular way. He'd stopped needing to ask things like that a while ago. He reached the back wall and put his shoulders against the stone. The stone was cold through his coat, and the coat still smelled of coal smoke and high-pass wind, and the stone's cold was an honest fact after the chamber's pressed warmth. He crossed his arms, not loosely, the pressure on his left arm deliberate and controlled, and watched her work. Her pen moved in tight, precise strokes across the decoding sheet, the compressed notations of someone who had done this often enough that the handwriting was smaller than anyone else's handwriting for the same content, because efficiency extended to every surface she worked on. She did not look up when he came to stand beside her. She had known he was there before he arrived. He had stopped being surprised by this. The chamber continued its grinding work in the background, the arguments building and shifting in their new configuration. 2 more telegrams had arrived at Wallace's desk while Vane was at the lectern. Gunnar had watched them land without counting. He was counting now. Vesper's pen slowed. She completed the final stroke of the final notation, set the pen down flat against the table's surface, not resting it in the groove at the table's edge, not tucking it behind the cipher pad, but flat, the full length of it on the table, and read the decoded message through once without speaking. Her face did not change. This was not the same as her face not doing anything. The jaw set was there, the one she used when she was applying the effort of her training to something that required that effort. And there was something around her eyes that was not quite the expression she'd had in the workshop after delivering the news about Hayden, but was in the same family of things. She looked up. "Vane's private engine," she said. Her voice was at the calibrated register, the one she used for information that needed to be delivered accurately rather than managed. "The ironclad Sovereign. Prepared for departure this morning. The staging crew was ordered at 4 a.m. The internal destination log shows a routine inspection run." She paused, the pause being structural rather than dramatic. "The route is north, through the high pass." Gunnar did not move off the wall. He received the information the way he received gauge readings, without expression, directing it immediately into the calculation that was already running. The Sovereign was Vane's personal engine. He had seen it twice on the depot sidings in Copper City, black lacquer, brass fittings, the Syndicate serpent emblazoned on the tender in gilded plate. A machine built to be seen and to move fast when it needed to, with enough boiler capacity for high-altitude runs that no freight engine would attempt in this weather. He knew the high pass route. He had run it last night. She had not said what was at the end of the route. She didn't need to say it. He knew it from the schematics still spread on the clerk's desk at the front of the chamber, the territorial map he had unrolled himself with his own hands, the grid laid. Thanks for listening to Iron Rails and Ruin. New chapters drop every Friday, and Smoke and Suspicion, Book 1, is now available on Amazon. If you liked Iron Rails and Ruin, listen to Eagle's Edge on Thursdays. A 16-year-old Roman recruit takes the oath, marches into Gaul, and learns what war actually is. Back to Iron Rails. Now, Vane didn't argue the evidence. He cut off freight to 6 winter towns and let the governor call it practical necessity. And Gunnar watched delegates start drifting away from the truth they'd just been shown. When the truth is inconvenient enough, who decides what practical really means? In Chapter 15, 72 hours are counting down, and Gunnar has to move before the legislature loses its nerve. This is Reed Sterling. Thank you for listening to Compass and Codex. Never stop exploring unknown worlds.